Du Fu missing Li Bai at the end of the earth. A cold wind comes up here at the end of the earth, and I wonder what your intentions are. When will my wild goose arrive at last? Lakes and rivers are swollen this autumn. Literature hates the writer who does too well. Mountain goblins eagerly await the traveller. You ought to talk with the wronged ghost of Chu Yuan. Drop him a poem offering in the Mi Luo River. So we continue with once more another example of Du Fu's pentasyllabic regulated poems. Missing Li Bai at the end of the earth. Now, we've already encountered, I think that was in the pentasyllabic old style poems, a couple of poems by Du Fu sent to Li Bai, and with their friendship as the topic of conversation. The topic of this poem is also basically friendship, desiring to receive news of a friend, but also in the way that it treats the subject, and because of the two participants, you could say, in this poetic dialogue, the sender and the receiver, it's also, its main topic will also be unrecognized merit. Explicitly the unrecognized merit of Li Bai, implicitly the self-same unrecognized merit of Du Fu. Okay, a couple of things first. So, what was the relationship between Li Bai and Du Fu? So, from what we have read, it would give the impression that they were friends. And this has been a common literary trope in traditional Chinese literature, to paint the two greatest poets of the Tang and probably of all Chinese literature as friends, in an antithetic way to what happens in Spanish literature, where probably the two greatest poets of the language, Góngora and Quevedo, were bitter enemies who wrote venomous poems insulting each other. Now, this view of Li and Du as friends, even though it might be partially legitimized by some poems, is generally not so eagerly accepted by others. I mean, they were acquaintances. We know that they met physically, face to face, no more than 2 times. We also know that when they met, Li Bai, who was the slightly older poet, was also the more prestigious at the time. I mean, he was already a literary rock star, a superstar, even if he hadn't managed to get the emperor's patronage. He was, recognized as a great poet and everywhere well received. Du Fu, as I think we've already mentioned, wasn't particularly successful during his lifetime, either as a scholar official or as a poet. He languished in obscurity. It would be later in the following generations when his poetry would be truly appreciated and elevated as a monument to the ideal of the Confucian scholar official. And perhaps this imbalance in the friendship between Li Bai and Du Fu is reflected in their poems. So we have, I think, about 10 poems or so from Du Fu dedicated to Li Bai, but there's only one poem by Li Bai talking about or dedicated to Du Fu in their entire poetic preserved corpus. Anyway, scholar officials wrote a lot of poems like this to different types of friends. From a certain point of view, any scholar official could be the friend of any other scholar official, as they were members of the same class with the same general intellectual interests and values and social values and philosophical principles and so on and so forth. Anyway, a little bit more background information about the time this poem is composed and its circumstances. This poem follows from the ones that we have just been commenting on Du Fu. So it's probably from 759. You will remember that Du Fu in 758 had resigned his minor posting in Huazhou, and he had gone to the area of Qin, to the west of the capital. Probably this poem was written in that area. We will explain why when we talk about the couplets, but basically the climatic and geographic features that are described in the poem seem to be pointing to that harsh, climatically speaking, region of the northwest of China, in the frontier between the Siberian steppe and the Chinese heartland. So Du Fu was there. He was starting a period of travels all through the country, which would take him west into the region of Shu, where he would linger for, I think it was about 5 years or so, and then down into the Jiangzi, where he would die. Very close to the area he mentions in this poem, very close to the Miluo River, was where Du Fu would finally die. So there is a disconcertingly prophetic and dark tone in some of the images that appear in this poem. What about Li Bai's career? We talked about that also when we talked about Li Bai, but just as a refresher, after the Alishan Rebellion, Li Bai was in the south of China, in the Jiangsu region. He supported or somehow ended up in the entourage of one of the imperial princes who attempted to rival Emperor Suzong for the imperial position, and as a consequence, Li Bai was sentenced to death. But, he was very soon amnestied, condemned to go to the remote southwest of China as an exile. He went very leisurely towards his intended exile destination, and before he reached it, he had been granted a pardon and was able to return to the Jiangsu region. So this is the context. When this poem was written, we do not know how much did Du Fu know about Li Bai's situation. He probably knew that Li Bai had been exiled, probably didn't know that he had been amnestied, and I've read somewhere that he had heard rumors in his area that Li Bai had drowned in the south, so maybe that's why there are references here in another of the poems that Du Fu dedicates to Li Bai about the perils of water and of crossing water. So let's go to the poem Little by Little. First couplet. A cold wind comes up here at the end of the earth, and I wonder what your intentions are. So cold wind, remember, this is the northwest of China, the frontier of the empire, so it would match the description of being at the end of the earth, as in the title and the first line. And this is a region that is close to the Siberian plateau, so the Siberian cold, freezing airs descend from autumn onwards into this region. So the cold wind, is really, really a realistic image, it's not just fancy. While feeling this cold, harsh weather, Du Fu is reminded of his friend Li Bai and wants to know what his thoughts might be. Second couplet, the first of the parallelistic ones. When will my wild goose arrive at last? Lakes and rivers are swollen this autumn. So the second couplet continues the line of the first one. We are clearly in the north. We're clearly with Du Fu. And he's wondering about the intentions of his friend. He's waiting for the wild goose. Remember, we've talked in a lot of poems. The wild goose is a symbol for messages, for letters. So he's anxiously awaiting letters, information about Li Bai, written by Li Bai. And, he's waiting for it to arrive from the south. And lakes and rivers are swollen this autumn. So in the north, in that northwestern region, autumn usually comes with heavy rains and floods, which would make any communication, even if Li Bai had written a letter, difficult. So letters would take even longer to arrive. Even if Li Bai had written a letter, even if Li Bai had gotten a messenger that was going to the north, and even if that messenger was eagerly trying to travel and to reach Du Fu, knowing that he was in the northwestern region of Qin. So anyway, the second part of this poem, which is the last two couplets, changes the focus from the north to the south. So up to now we've been mainly involved with what Du Fu is experiencing, the weather, the place he's in, his thoughts about his friend. In the second part we get more clearly transference of images to the south. And to Li Bai. Literature hates the writer who does too well. Mountain goblins eagerly await the traveler. So this is a form of consolation. Du Fu is attempting some consolation to Li Bai for his misfortunes. And he's saying, good writers like you, and perhaps implicitly like me, they seldom do well. They encounter envy, they encounter bad luck and disgrace. And, mountain goblins eagerly await the traveler to eat them. This time some Chinese would believe that there were mountain spirits that ate travelers. But perhaps this image is also meant in a double sense. So those mountain goblins might be a symbol for those envious people at court who envy and hate good writers, wise writers like Li Bai, and who conspire against them. Yeah. You ought to talk with the wronged ghost of Chu Yuan. Drop him a poem offering into the Miluo River. So, what to do when you are hated by others? Well, what he proposes, Du Fu is suspecting that Li Bai is in the area of the ancient state of Chu, probably close to the Dongting lakes and to the merging of the Xiang and Yangtze river valleys. Now that area, the state of Chu, was associated with at least one or two important poets in the past that had been good writers and loyal courtiers who had been scorned, and so they were always good exemplar to quote in a poem. So Chu Yuan, I think we've mentioned him before. He was a late Warring States period official and writer who wrote the Li Sao, and basically it's a long poem that was about lots of shamanistic and southern imagery about a worthy scholar official not being recognized by his ruler. And the legend said that he had committed suicide in the Miluo River after making his poems and complaints, and after being exiled by his king. So, because he's going to pass the region, Du Fu is advising Li Bai, talk with the wronged ghost of Chu Yuan, because he is like us, he is like you, he is like me, a worthy, good writer, worthy, moral scholar official who has been wronged and calumnied. He says, drop him a poem offering in the Miluo River. So one way of communicating with the ghost would be writing a poem, throwing it in the river, so that the spirit, the ghost of Chu Yuan can read it. This action also points to a precedent. So during the early Western Han Dynasty, there was a writer called Jia Ji, who, he was quite a good writer of Fu. Some of his texts and poems have been preserved, including the poem of the owl, the Fu Niao Fu. And he was exiled to the south, to Changsha, this same region. And while he was there, he did this self-same action that Du Fu was talking about. He wrote a poem offering and offered it to the soul of Chu Yuan, identifying himself with Chu Yuan. So we have an accumulation of images since the previous couplet until this one, which all point in the same direction. That is, the scholar official who is calumnied, whose merit is not recognized. And, these images are given as a sort of consolation for Li Bai and perhaps implicitly for Du Fu himself.